Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Parish of the Good Shepherd in Waban, Massachusetts, for this, the fourth Sunday in Lent, for our Adult Forum series on the Stature of Waiting by W.H. Vanstone. My name is Father Michael Bousquet. It's a pleasure to see you all this morning. As always, this first part of our Adult Forum is recorded and posted to our parish YouTube channel. So you can view it later. And in fact, if you are viewing us on YouTube this morning or at some other time, welcome to you as well. As always, I have a short presentation on the chapter or chapters that we will be addressing this morning. So let me share my screen momentarily. Okay. And hopefully you are now seeing that. Wonderful. This morning, we are addressing two chapters. We have a double header. We're going to be looking at chapter 5 and chapter 6 of Vanstone's book. And just a reminder where we were last week and the week before, we were looking at our own passion, those points in our life when we pass into dependence, pass into being the object of other people's actions. And Vanstone says this happens many times in our lives, sort of at the end of our life in old age, in retirement, whenever we're unemployed, and even within our working life. There are increasingly instances where we have to wait upon the actions of others. And he says, we resent this. We don't really like passing into passion, really. And the reason for that, twofold. First is because of capitalism. Capitalism only values people who are productive and creating things. And capitalism so dominates our life here in the Western world that it influences our sense of value in all spheres of our life. And the second reason is because of Christianity, not just because of the Protestant work ethic, but because of a taproot within Christianity that spans back millennia. The first is a theology that we are made in the image of God. And the second is a theology that God is purus actus, pure activity. Right? So in all those ways in which we are active and productive and doing things, we can reflect our godliness. We can reflect those ways in which we were made in the image of God, because God is pure activity. And in all those ways in which we're passive and dependent, well, then we are ungodlike, because we are not reflecting God's nature. And Vanstone also has a little bit of constructive ethical theory. He sort of argues that what gives us dignity is not our activity or our capacity for activity, but a confluence of our capacity for activity and our capacity for passivity or passibility. That unique among all creatures in the earth, we can do a lot and also have a lot done to us. And he says in these coming chapters, we're going to create some theology around this. How is this reflected in Jesus's life? So Vanstone, ever the armchair philosopher, begins chapter 5 by thinking about empathy, really. How is God empathetic with us and how are we empathetic with God? And he says, anytime we go through troubles, anytime we go through difficulty, it's a source of comfort to know that Jesus knows all about it because Jesus went through the same stuff. Right? Anytime we face temptation, anytime we are abandoned by our friends, anytime we experience pain or suffering, it is a comfort to know that Jesus experienced all of it as well. And he uses Joan of Arc as an example. When Joan of Arc was burning to a crisp on the pyre, someone presented to her a woven cross, and she gazed upon it, and seeing the cross gave her the strength to endure this horrific, painful death. And Vanstone says that, when we're not otherwise experiencing pain, we might question the logic of this, right? Why is it that pain is more bearable or more bravely borne for the knowledge that anyone, Jesus or not, has borne similar pain? It doesn't make any sense, right? But there it is, it's true. There are many instances of this occurring, people in the midst of pain or suffering, thinking of Jesus and feeling comfort, knowing that Jesus knows what they are going through, right? But Vanstone says, that's not what my book is about, right? Vanstone argues that passion is not exclusively or even primarily about pain. It is about dependence, about exposure, waiting, being no longer in control of one's own situation, being the object of what is done to oneself. So Vanstone thinks, well, if that's the case, perhaps the passion of Jesus, that is, Jesus moving into the state of dependence, connects not just with our pain, but with all of our experiences of transitioning into a more dependent phase of life. So whenever we go to the hospital or retire or lose a job or have to wait upon the actions of others, anytime we feel like we are on the sidelines or useless or ineffective, anytime we feel like we are no longer making our mark, it might be helpful to think of Jesus, right? And we might be able to draw some emotional strength from Jesus's experience of passion. Well, perhaps, maybe for some very devout Christians, this might work, but probably not for everyone else, right? Vanstone says that if people regard their own transition into passion as a sad misfortune, because again of these twin forces in life, right? Capitalism, which only values productivity, and these dual theologies within Christianity of we are made in the image of God and God is purus actus. Because of these reasons, if most of us regard our own transition to passion as a sad misfortune, we're going to project that back onto Jesus and say that it was a sad misfortune that Jesus ended up in the same way and entered into passion, right? That otherwise he would have had a great life, wonderful ministry, did some excellent things, but in the end, well, he fell into the hands of Jewish authorities and into the hands of Pilate and was treated by them in the way they chose to treat him. And people will see a tragedy in the passion. And believe it or not, I actually think that's a little bit true, right? If you look at the life of the church, we spend all this time focusing on Jesus's ministry, his teaching, his healing, all the great miracles he performed. And then we say, oh, well, you know, at the end there, he was arrested, betrayed, crucified and killed. But resurrection was right around the corner. And then we focus again on Easter and the post-resurrection stories. And we sort of just skip over the passion. We don't like to dwell on the passion as a church. And I do believe that it is because of a deep-seated, perhaps subconscious resentment of our own experiences of passion. We don't really want or value passion. We see it as a sad misfortune, and therefore we don't really want to focus on Jesus's passion as a church. I'm going to talk more about this next week on the 5th Sunday in Lent. So stay tuned next week for this point. But to get back to where we were, Vanstone says, okay, so the fact that Jesus passed into passion, simply put, is itself not an adequate basis for positively understanding or accepting our own experiences of passion, right? So let's go back to the text. Let's go back to the Gospels and understand just how passing into passion was not just mere unfortune or tragedy for Jesus, but was rather a triumph, not a diminution, but an elevation. So he's going to look at our two primary Gospels, two archetypal Gospels, Mark and John. Mark, remember, is the prototype for Matthew and Luke. So therefore, he's going to focus on Mark. And John is out there in left field. So John is his own thing. Let's look at these two Gospels. And in Mark, he looks at what is happening at the cross. The foot of the cross, as Jesus is dying, there's a centurion who looks up and says, ah, truly this man was the Son of God. And Vanstone says, why does he say that? Why does this centurion say that? There is, in fact, nothing happening that would merit this declaration. It's not like in Matthew, where as Jesus is dying, there's an earthquake that the centurion can feel and can recognize that this is the death of a god, right? And it's not like in Luke, where you have the two thieves on either side, and Jesus offers magnanimously to one of them that you this day will be in paradise with me, sort of an act of salvation from the cross. Jesus doesn't do anything from the cross in Mark. And Vanstone says that's actually key. The fact that Jesus is not doing anything, the only thing that is happening is that Jesus is being done to, that in and of itself manifests his divinity. And that is what the centurion is recognizing when he sees and says, truly this man was the Son of God. So very interesting, right? That what evidence is there for Jesus's divinity? nothing but the fact that he is being acted upon. Pretty amazing. And then Vanstone's going to go to the Gospel of John. And John, of course, is a very complex theological gospel. So he's going to take some time breaking this down. But he also looks at Jesus' final words on the cross in John. And he says, it is finished. And then he gives up the ghost and he dies. But Vanstone says, let's go back a little bit to the Last Supper when Jesus prays to his Father. He says, I have finished the work thou gavest me to do. Well, if at the Last Supper, Jesus has finished the work that he has been given to do, and yet on the cross, he says, it is finished. Everything is now finished. That implies that there was something between the Last Supper and his death on the cross that still needed to be completed. And what was that? Well, the Passion, namely, right? So in John, the Passion was the completion of Jesus's divine purpose and mission in coming into the world. And he's going to actually look a little bit more into this because in John, if you know John, it's all about glory, right? Many times in the Gospel of John, we hear that the Son glorifies the Father and the Father glorifies the Son. It's sort of this reflective act of glorification that Jesus and his Father participate in, both manifest in one unity, the divinity of God. And Vanstone pulls out 3 points that talk about glorification, talk about glory. And he says that these points actually point to a transition. So the first is John 12:28. This is in Jerusalem, where Jesus prays to the Father, Father, glorify thy name. And he hears from heaven a voice that says, I have glorified it and will glorify it again. And then in John 13:31, Jesus says, now the Son has been glorified. This is at the Last Supper. And then a little while later, Jesus says, and God will glorify him again. And then also later, Jesus prays, I have glorified thee on earth. Now glorify me in thyself with the glory which I had before the world began. What Vanstone says in all of these quotes is that they point to a bifurcation of glory, sort of a 2-part glorification. Now, if we look at that first quote, 12:28, what has just happened in the Gospel of John is that Jesus has entered into Jerusalem after passing through Bethany, where he rose Lazarus from the dead. And if you remember what Jesus says about the death of Lazarus, why Lazarus had to die, well, he died so that he could give glory, essentially, to his Father. Essentially, to show that God has the power to grant new life, resurrected life. That is the first type of glorification, right? The first type of glorification is all the things that Jesus has done in his ministry, his teaching, his preaching, his feeding, his casting out of demons, all of the miracles he performed, everything that reveals his Father's will and heralds the coming of the kingdom of heaven, everything that shows the power of God is the glorification of God. That is how, as the voice from heaven has said, I have already glorified thy Father's name through these acts, right? And yet there's a second glorification to come. And in the Gospel of John, everything to come is the passion, the death, the resurrection, and the ascension, right? It's sort of a long, complex continuum of events that happen after Jesus enters into passion. And Vanstone sort of glosses over this theology. In John, you could probably say that in the passion, you can sort of look forward to the resurrection, and they're all sort of present within this second type of glorification. The glorification of the cross is in some ways also the glorification of the resurrection, right? Because the resurrection triumphs over the cross. Vanstone doesn't want to get into this theology, but he says in this entire continuum of events, the passion, the death, resurrection, and ascension, there is actually one event, more so than in any other, that reveals this glory and reveals the divinity of Jesus. And he says that is in the Garden of Gethsemane. In the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus is arrested, right? And as the crowd is coming to arrest him, he asks them, whom do you seek? And they say, Jesus of Nazareth. And he replies, I am he. And that statement of I am he, is the great I am, the I am who I am of God that we hear in the Old Testament. And in John, we hear that when Jesus says this, everybody draws back and then falls to the ground. I have a quote here on page 75 that I want to read. In John's gospel, there is no transfiguration on the mountaintop, right? No moment where we see the glory of God in Jesus Christ and everyone falls down in front of him, James, John, and Peter. In some ways, the transfiguration is transferred to the Garden of Gethsemane in the Gospel of John. And it's when he is handed over, when he is being arrested, that those who are witnessing it, those who have actually come to arrest him, bear witness to the divinity of God by recognizing the great I am and falling down before Jesus in humility. It is as if in the Garden of Gethsemane, that moment is the moment in which the ultimate dimension of divine glory becomes manifest to the people who are there in the garden, right? This is very interesting, right? That the true glory of God is not a mountaintop experience in the Gospel of John. There's no Mount Tabor, there's no transfiguration. The transfiguration, the experience of the glory of God is in Gethsemane when Jesus is being arrested and people fall down before him at that point. That's when his divinity is revealed, when he's entering into passion. Pretty interesting. Okay, so what does Van Stone do at this point? He says, let me tell you a story of Jesus. Now, this is the story of Jesus in a way that you've probably not heard the story of Jesus before. He tells this story of a Jewish rabbi from Galilee who is preaching the good news of the kingdom of God, right? And this kingdom invites a certain response amongst the people who hear this proclamation, calls for a conversion of the heart and of the mind, and it calls people to discipleship. Jesus wants everyone to hear this message. And he doesn't think it's just a message for individuals, right? This is a message for him that all of Israel, his entire people, need to hear. And he wants everyone to be converted in mind and in heart. But he knows the only way that everyone's going to be converted is if he goes to the top, to the religious authorities, and gets them on his side so that they can also put forward this message. So he needs to win over the nation's leaders in Jerusalem. And he knows that he can't just go to Jerusalem and preach this message to the religious leaders, because they'll dismiss him as some eccentric rabbi from Galilee, a nobody, right? So he needs to show that his message not only makes sense, but that it's got a popular following behind him. So Jesus makes a plan to go to Jerusalem at a time when everyone is there. We have all of these pilgrim peasants from Galilee coming to Jerusalem for the Passover. And many of them are his disciples. Many of them have been won over by his message. They have had this conversion of heart and mind. And so he now has a popular following behind him. And it is through this that Jesus will put forth his message to the religious leaders. But this will force a response on their part, right? If he had come alone, they could have easily dismissed him and ignored him. But because he has this crowd of people who support him, it sort of forces their hand. They can't ignore Jesus. And really, there's only one of two possible outcomes. Either they will recognize this popular movement and want to get behind it and support Jesus and have their own conversion of heart and mind and join the kingdom, join the good news, right? This is what Jesus wants. Or they will see this crowd of people with a sort of quasi-religious leader as a cult and as a challenge to their religious authority, they will violently put it down, right? These are really the only two possible reactions, but what Jesus is doing is forcing a response by coming to Jerusalem. So Vanstone points out that Jesus didn't really desire his own death. He didn't want to die. And I think that, of course, Jesus may have suspected, given that he's forcing this issue, that he will probably be arrested and put to death. That's probably the most likely outcome of all of this. And in fact, he says this many times in the gospel, that the Son of Man must suffer and die, because he's sort of accurately predicting what's going to happen. But Jesus still holds out hope, even if it's a tiny hope, that the religious leaders at the last moment will opt to join him in his movement. And Vanstone says that really the agony in the Garden of Gethsemane is this tension between correctly suspecting that death was coming down the pike for Jesus, but also clinging to the hope that what Jesus really wanted, a conversion of all of Israel, could still be possible. And he was willing to put everything on the line, even his own life, to make that possibility real. So Vanstone has this sort of line, wrapping all of that up. Jesus handed himself over unto death, as any man does, who in the cause of some great good exposes himself to the probable loss of everything, even his own life. Jesus willed to be so handed over because there was no other way in which the appeal of the kingdom could so powerfully and realistically be presented to the nation's leaders. And really, this is where Vanstone sort of sums it all up in chapter 6 with an exposition on love, right? Vanstone's argument ultimately is that this willingness to give everything, even his own life, to make possible the conversion of hearts and minds is what love looks like, right? Vanstone says that love acts of its own initiative under no compulsion or constraint in order that another may benefit. And in authentic love, there's no control of the other who is loved, right? So when our work of love is done, we are destined to wait upon the outcome, to see whether our love is accepted or rejected. So on page 96, Vanstone sort of has this concluding line: through our own initiative in loving, we create a situation of which the issue passes out of our hands, right? We place what is done or given in other hands to be accepted or rejected. And since what is done or given in authentic love is without limit or qualification, is in fact ourselves and our own destiny that we place into others' hands, where love is action is destined to pass into passion, working into waiting. And so really what this means is that if God really so loved the world to come and dwell amongst us, that love was destined to end in passion. God so loved us that God would have put God's self in a situation where he had to wait to see whether we would accept or reject his act of love. That's really what love is about. Now, this is chapter 5 and 6, presented in a nice, tight little argument. Vanstone, of course, has a lot more in 5 and 6 than just this presentation of waiting and then love, right? And there are some things that I do want to comment on these chapters, because I do think they are important, but they sort of sit within Vanstone's argument like these giant icebergs. And Vanstone could definitely benefit from an editor to clean up his work and make it a little bit more tidy. So I'm going to take a step back from this to present sort of two possible points that Vanstone has. And before I get to them, I do want to have this sort of final presentation. This is where we come in with our stature of waiting, right? So Vanstone says, we perceive that the ultimate dimension of the glory of God lies in that activity which creates in its end its own passion, working which in the end destines itself to waiting. And he says, the most glorious activity of God is that he hands himself over and in his free activity of loving surrenders his own impassibility. God is actus purus, pure activity, but within the range of divine activity, is the activity of self-exposure. So this is how Vanstone is sort of redeeming actus purus, right? He's not going to deny it, but he's going to say within the range of the activity that God can do is really the activity of putting himself into a stature of waiting. Waiting upon his own creation, no less, right? And the image of God in humanity is the image of this God, right? A God who in loving expresses himself to be the object no less than the subject of that which happens in the world. So humanity is no less godlike when we are waiting upon the world than when we are working on and achieving within the world. So this is how Vanstone is going to apply this to us, and we're going to see more of this next week. So this is really where we're leading into the final chapter of Vanstone's book. But sorry, I was a little out of order here. So I do want to point out these 2 points that Vanstone has that I think are important, but aren't really part of his argument. So the first is the discourse on passibility. And he wants to talk about this ibel or abel ending, which he says means probability, not certainty. So things that are laudable are things that should be lauded, but they might not be lauded, right? Things that are incredible are things that should not be believed, but yeah, some people do believe incredible things. Things that are unpardonable should not be pardoned, but they might be pardoned, right? And things that are impassible should not be able to be moved into passion, into passibility, but that might mean that they are, right? And so this is how he says God is impassible, but that doesn't mean that it's impossible for God to move into passion, because God does, of course, and within the range of God's activity is the activity that moves God's self within the range of passibility. So probability, not certainty. And the other is, where is the locus of salvation, right? For most of Christian history, we think of Jesus's death as salvific, right? It is a sacrificial death for the expiation of sins. And Vanstone says this is very old theology. It's ancient theology, sacrificial death. Way back into ancient Israel, and all really ancient religions of the world had sacrifice, the sacrifice of animals, even the sacrifice of other human beings. Think of the potential sacrifice of Isaac, right? Even in Jesus's day, you couldn't worship in the temple unless you sacrificed animals, doves or sheep or oxen, right? These are burnt offerings that were pleasing to God. And so the first Christians, of course, would also play around with this theology that Christ died as a sacrifice for our sins. But Vincent says that's no longer relevant to us today as contemporary Christians. That is not a theology that we play around with. Nobody thinks that God demands sacrifice anymore. And he says it's a lot like the theology that would spatially orient heaven above the solar system, right? Nobody believes that, or nobody should believe that anymore, that heaven is spatially oriented to Earth in a certain way in our cosmos. So that's a theology that we've jettisoned. So why should we not also jettison a theology of sacrifice? And Vanstone says, even if early Christians did understand sacrificial death, they didn't exclusively think of the passion in that way, right? Because early Christians did write, he was handed over for us. They could have written, he died for us, or he was put to death for us. They could have had purely a theology of sacrifice. But it was actually the passion, the handing over, that was important for early Christians. And therefore, for Vanstone, it's actually the passion, this act of handing over, which is salvific. It's not the death, the termination of the action, of the act of passion, right? Passion was from his arrest, theoretically, everything that happened on the cross. And then when he died, he's dead, right? So that the passion ends with his death. It's not the death that was salvific. It was this expanse of passion that was salvific in Vanstone's book. So anyway, 2 points that I wanted to address because they were in Vanstone's chapters. I think they were important to hear, but they don't really sort of fit with that flow of his argument that ends with love, really. So I think that's a good way to end the presentation today. Next week, 5th Sunday in Lent, we'll be looking at the last chapter, which is a little short, so it will be a short presentation, but we're going to have a longer discussion on why this book, The Stature of Waiting, is important, important in this year, 2021, but I think important overall. And I showed my hand a little bit by pointing out why. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that we avoid the passion in the life of the church. We don't focus on it in the way that we ought to, and there's probably a reason for that. So come back next week, 5th Sunday in Lent. I look forward to seeing you there. Thank you very much.